She was 22 and left for dead on the winter trail above Elk Ridge. No family waiting for her, no coin in her pocket, just a tin locket at her throat and the borrowed wool coat on her back. The men who had put her there rode down the switchbacks, certain that the snow would finish what they had not had the stomach to do themselves. A green-skinned girl alone on a mountain in December. The cold would take her, the wind would erase her. By spring, nobody would remember she had been there at all. What none of them knew, and what Mara herself did not yet know, was that half a mile off the ridge stood an old line shack with a pine floor. And beneath that floor, a sealed root cellar had been waiting 90 years for someone exactly like her to find it. Settle in with me. Tell me where you are watching from. And stay close, because this one is worth the whole telling. Mara had been born in a 2-room house on the flats below Elk Ridge in the last week of a hard march. The 4th child and the only daughter of a hired-out cattleman named Henlar, who worked other men's herds his whole life and never owned a foot of ground of his own. The Orc settlements on the flats were places where families like Mara's ended up after the resettlement treaties had given them land rights on paper and isolation in practice. Good enough ground to survive on, not good enough to prosper, and far enough from the human towns that the distance itself was a kind of message. Her mother died of a fever the summer Mara turned 7. Her 3 older brothers were scattered by wage work before she was 10. One to the rail crews east of the Divide, one to a freight outfit in the low desert country, and the youngest, a boy named Bryn, gone north with a horse string, and never heard from again after the second winter. Henler did what men of his kind did in those years, which was to leave the child with whoever would take her and send back what money he could. And so Mara was raised in pieces. 6 months here and 8 months there, learning early how to be useful in a stranger's kitchen and how to hold her tongue at another woman's table. In Orc homes, she was the girl whose father could not keep her. In human homes, she was the green one. Neither place was home. The one place she was not held as a stranger was the small holding of a widow named Hetka Bram, who kept a pole-fenced garden and 11 laying hens in a dry goods stall on market Saturdays at the crossroads below the ridge. Hetka was near 60 when Mara first came to her, a stout, square-shouldered Orc woman with knuckles like walnut wood and a habit of speaking only when speech would carry weight. She had lived alone since her husband died in the same year. The last treaty was signed, and she had made her peace with solitude the way certain people do, not by filling it with noise, but by filling it with competence. She took the girl in 3 separate winters between the ages of 9 and 15, and she taught her the things a girl on her own would need to know. She taught her how to lay a fire that would hold coals through the night, and how to bank it in the morning so the kitchen would still be warm at noon. She taught her how to render tallow, how to cure a haunch, how to salt a hide, how to read weather off the shoulder of a mountain, and how to walk in snow without breaking through the crust. She taught her the names of the plants that grew above the tree line, and which of them would keep a person alive between one town and the next. She taught her how to sharpen an axe with slow, circular strokes on a flat stone, until the edge would part a hair off her green forearm. And she taught her, without ever putting it into a sentence, that a woman who could keep her hands busy could keep her mind whole. The only object Hetka ever gave her outright was a small tin locket on a braided horsehair cord, plain as a nailhead and unadorned, except for a scratched initial H on the back, and inside it a folded square of paper on which Hetka had written in her careful, sloping hand the words, "Be steady." Mara was 15 when Hetka died in her sleep between one Saturday market and the next, and Mara was the one who found her. And Mara was the one who washed her and laid her out and combed her gray hair and folded her hands on her chest in the way that Orc women prepared their dead, with the palms turned upward, open, as though still ready to give. And when the burial was over and the neighbors had taken back the borrowed chairs and the borrowed lamps, Mara walked the 4 miles back to her father's boarding room with the locket at her throat and did not take it off again. If you're listening to this story and you want to hear where it goes, take a moment right now and hit subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human. Then tap the like button and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. There are more stories like this, and every one of them is worth your time. By the time she was 22, Henlar had been dead 19 months of a lung sickness he brought down from a high camp. The small wages he had left behind in a leather pouch under a floorboard had gone to bury him and to settle a doctor's bill and a store account. And Mara was working as a hired girl in the household of a human rancher named Rutherford Ames, whose spread lay along the North Fork below the ridge. She kept his kitchen and his laundry and helped his wife with the 2 small children. She was paid in room and board and $3 a month, and she saved what she could in a tobacco tin behind the flour bin. She was the only orc in the household. She ate in the kitchen after the family ate in the dining room. She slept in the small room behind the pantry, where the previous hired girl, a human woman, had slept in a proper bed. Mara slept on a straw tick on the floor because Mrs. Ames had taken the bed back into the house without explanation. Mara did not ask about it. She had learned a long time ago that asking questions in another person's house was a way of finding out things you would rather not know. She believed, as young women of her circumstance were taught to believe, that if she was steady and useful and quiet, the work would carry her forward into something better. It was a reasonable belief. It was also the belief that put her on a bright, cold morning in the second week of December, on the winter trail above Elk Ridge, with 2 men who did not intend for her to come down. The way it happened was this. On the first Monday of December, Rutherford Ames rode into the yard from 3 days at the stockyards and did not come into the kitchen for his supper. Mara heard him talking with his wife in the front room for a long time, and the tone of the talk was the tone of a decision already made, being explained rather than debated. And Mara went on wiping down the stove and setting the bread to rise because she had been taught by Hetka Bram that a person listening for their own name in another room hears only trouble and never the whole shape of it. In the morning, Mrs. Ames came into the kitchen with her hands folded flat against her apron and told Mara, in the voice a woman uses when she has practiced the sentence before the mirror, that the household would be reduced after the new year, and that Mara's place could not be kept on. Mrs. Ames did not look at Mara while she said it. She looked at the breadboard and at the salt cellar and at the calico curtain over the window above the wash bench. She said that Mr. Ames had made an arrangement that Mara would be paid out her month and given a written character. That 2 hired hands would take her over the ridge to the settlement at Bell Fork, where a family called Orland was in need of a girl for the winter and had agreed by letter to take her on. Mara said, "Yes, ma'am, thank you," and asked when she was to leave, and Mrs. Ames said Thursday, weather permitting, and left the kitchen without waiting for Mara to say anything more. Mara finished the bread. She kneaded it and shaped it, and put it into the 2 loaf pans and set them near the stove to rise a second time. And only when the loaves were in the oven did she go into the pantry and take down the tobacco tin from behind the flour bin and open it on the shelf and count what was inside. There had been $11.40 saved over 14 months. There were now $4.80. Someone had taken $6.60 from the tin, while Mara slept on her straw tick in the room behind the pantry. She stood with the tin in her hand for a long moment, and did not say anything, and did not weep, because weeping in another woman's pantry was a thing Hetka had told her never to do. And then she put the $4.80 into the small cotton pouch she kept pinned inside her petticoat, and put the empty tin back on the shelf, exactly where it had been. On Thursday morning, the 2 hired hands were waiting in the yard with 3 saddled horses and a pack mule. Mara knew them by name and by little else. The older was a man called Ford Kessler, thin and long-jawed, a human who had worked for Ames off and on for 6 years and had never once spoken to Mara at the kitchen door except to ask for coffee. The younger was a man called Ridley Pace, 19, with a poor beard and a habit of laughing at things that were not funny and looking at Mara with an expression she had learned to walk away from without comment. Mara carried out her bundle: 2 dresses, a second pair of stockings, a wool shawl, a comb, a thin bar of lye soap, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cheesecloth, and a hard sausage. She had on her calico dress and her wool underskirt and her heaviest stockings, and the borrowed wool coat that had belonged to Mrs. Ames's brother before he moved east. And around her throat, Under the collar was the tin locket on its braided horsehair cord. Mrs. Ames came out onto the porch and gave Mara the written character in a folded envelope, and did not embrace her. Mr. Ames did not come out at all. Ford Kessler took the bundle and lashed it to the pack mule and told Mara to mount up, and the three of them rode out of the yard at a slow walk with the sun not yet clear of the ridge. The trail up from the North Fork climbs through pine timber for the first 4 miles, and then breaks into open switchbacks that run along the shoulder of Elk Ridge in a long north-bearing traverse. The morning was bright and very cold, the kind of cold that dries the inside of the nose and makes the pines crack in their bark. And the snow along the trail was old snow packed hard on the shaded side and drifted soft on the sunny side where the wind had worked it. Mara rode behind Ford Kessler and ahead of Ridley Pace, and neither man spoke to her, and she did not speak to them. She watched the country as she rode because Hetka had taught her that a person who does not know where they are is already half lost. She counted the drainages coming down off the ridge from the west and marked the shape of each one. She noted the burned snag at the second switchback and the leaning fir at the fourth. She saw the tracks of an elk cow and a single calf crossing the trail at the top of the pine timber, headed down for lower feed, and she saw where a bobcat had crossed after them in the night and turned aside. She kept her hands in her coat pockets when she could, and out of them when she needed the reins, and she flexed her green fingers inside her woolen mittens every few minutes to keep the feeling in them. They stopped once, near noon, in a small flat, where the trail bent around a granite shoulder, and a spring came out from under a rock. Ford Kessler let the horses drink and gave Mara a hard biscuit from his saddlebag, and Ridley Pace laughed at something he said quietly and then stopped laughing when Ford looked at him. Mara ate the biscuit and drank from the spring with her cupped hand, and did not ask how much farther Bell Fork was, because she had understood, without allowing herself yet to name the understanding, that they were not riding toward Bell Fork. Bell Fork lay east and a little south. They had been riding north and west all morning. The sun told her that, and the drainages told her that, and the tilt of the ridge above her left shoulder told her that. She had been reading the land since she was 9 years old, when Hetka had taught her to orient herself by mountain shoulders and water flow, and the way shadow fell across a valley in the afternoon. She got back on the bay mare when Ford Kessler told her to, and they went on climbing. By the middle of the afternoon, they were above the last of the pine timber, and out on the bare shoulder of the ridge, where the wind ran unbroken from the northwest, and the snow lay in long white sheets between outcrops of dark rock. The sky had gone from bright to milk. Ford Kessler drew rein at a place where the trail widened into a shelf above a long, steep drop into a valley Mara did not know. He sat his horse for a moment, looking down into it. Then he swung out of the saddle and came around and lifted Mara down off the bay mare without a word. He took the reins out of her hand. Ridley Pace was already at the pack mule, untying her bundle. He set it down in the snow at Mara's feet and went back to his horse. He did not look at her face. Ford Kessler said, not unkindly and not kindly either, that Mr. Ames had asked them to see her over the ridge, and this was the ridge. And there was a wagon road 3 days' walk down the valley to the north that would take her to a rail town if she kept going. And he wished her luck. He mounted up. He turned his horse. He and Ridley Pace rode back down the switchbacks the way they had come, and the sound of the horses in the packed snow grew smaller for a long time, and then was gone. And Mara was alone on the shoulder of Elk Ridge, with a bundle at her feet and the wind coming up. A green-skinned girl in a borrowed coat on a white mountain with $4.80 and a tin locket and nothing else between her and the winter that was closing in from every direction. She stood a long minute where they had set her down, listening to the wind take the last of them out of hearing. She did not weep. She did not curse. She did not sit down in the snow and wait for the cold to make the decision for her. She did what Hetka Brahm had taught her to do. She figured out where she was. She was above the last timber on the west shoulder of Elk Ridge, and the wind was out of the northwest. The pine line she had ridden up through lay somewhere below and behind her to the south, and she remembered a low roof she had seen from the trail an hour before. They crested the shelf. It had stood off the trail to the west in a fold of the ridge, a dark square set against the snow 1/2 mile back and a little down. She had marked it because Hetka had taught her to mark such things. Every shelter, every water source, every change in the ground. A person who pays attention to the country as she moves through it is a person who has choices when the country turns against her. Mara bent and picked up her bundle by its knot and settled the borrowed wool coat closer at her throat and turned her back on the drop into the North Valley and began to walk. She went back the way the horses had gone, as far as the second bend. Then she left the trail and cut down across the sheeted snow on the traverse she had held in her head. The crust took her weight for 3 steps and broke. On the 4th, she went into her knee, dragged herself out, and went on. The orc muscle in her legs, the dense, heavy strength that made her kind built for endurance, helped but did not make it easy. Cold was cold. Snow was snow. The wind did not care what color the skin was that it was trying to freeze. She kept the wind on her right cheek. She kept her mittened hands closed on the knot of her bundle. She did not hurry because Hetka had told her that hurry in deep snow was another word for exhaustion. And she did not stop because to stop on that shoulder in that wind was to sit down and not get up. The light was going out of the sky in a slow, even way that had nothing to do with clouds. It was the light of a December afternoon at altitude, draining away as though someone were lowering a wick. Mara counted her breaths in 4s the way Hetka had taught her, because counting gave the mind something to hold on to when the body wanted to quit. After a long time, she came round the side of a granite outcrop and saw the lined shack below her in the fold, sunk to its eaves on the north side, its roof a black wedge in the last white light. It was a low building of squared timber, no bigger than 12 feet by 16, set with its long wall to the south and its door in that wall. The logs were silvered to the color of driftwood and chinked with pale clay that had fallen out in long seams, so that the north wall showed dark stripes where the wind had worked through. The roof was split, cedar shakes laid double, and half the ridgeline had gone soft with rot, and a slow slump in the middle showed where a beam had sagged over the years without giving way. A stovepipe of tin came up through the shakes on the east end, rusted at the crown and braced with wire to a peg driven into the ridge. There was no window on the north side. A single small window on the south had been boarded from inside with a piece of packing crate, and the boards were still sound. The door was of 6 vertical planks held by 2 batten crosspieces and a wooden latch on a leather thong, and the thong had gone stiff and dark, and Mara worked it with her mittened thumb until the latch lifted and the door came inward against the drift with a low sound. Inside was dim and dry and much colder than she had hoped, and much warmer than the wind outside. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes learn the room. The floor was pine plank, wide boards laid tight, and gone the color of tobacco worn in a shallow track between the door and the stove. The stove was a small box stove of cast iron, no bigger than a bread crate, set on 4 flat river stones, its door hanging open, its firebox clean and dry. A short stack of split pine lay in the corner behind it, gray with dust but sound. A tin can of pine splits and shavings sat on the hearthstone. Along the west wall was a plank bunk built into the logs, with a straw tick gone flat and brown, and a folded gray blanket of coarse wool at the head. Above the bunk, 2 wooden pegs held a length of oiled canvas. A shelf ran the length of the north wall at shoulder height and carried a tin plate, a tin cup, a small iron skillet with a broken handle mended by a wire wrap, a stub of tallow candle in a saucer, and a rust-spotted tin of matches with a screw lid. In one corner stood a short-handled axe with a chipped edge and a worn helve. Everything in the room had been left ready by somebody who had meant to come back, and had not. Mara shut the door behind her and dropped the wooden bar into its cleats. She set her bundle on the bunk. She took off her mittens with her teeth and blew on her green fingers and did not sit down. She laid a fire in the stove the way Hetka had taught her. Shavings first, then pine splits crossed above them, the smallest ones at the bottom where the flame would catch, and the larger ones above where the heat would climb. She took a match from the tin and struck it on the stove's iron and held it to the shavings until they caught a small yellow flame that curled and grew. and she closed the stove door on it and heard the tin stack begin to draw. The fire made a sound like breathing, and the room began to change around it. Only then did she sit on the edge of the bunk and put her hands on her knees and let the shaking come. Not from cold alone, from everything, from the ride up the mountain with men who were taking her to nowhere. From the moment Ford Kessler lifted her off the horse and set her bundle in the snow, from the walk through the breaking crust with the light going and the wind pressing against her, like something with intentions, from the fact that she was alive and inside, and warm, and had no way of knowing whether she would be any of those things tomorrow. The stove made its small, even noise, and after a long time the room began to smell of warming iron and warming pine. And Mara got up and walked the perimeter of the floor with a candle stub she had lit off the stove. She was looking for mouse holes and drafts and the places where the boards had gone soft, because Hedka had taught her that in any house not lived in, the floor tells the truth first. Under the shelf on the north wall, the boards were sound and dry. Along the west wall by the bunk, they were sound. But when she came around to the space between the stove and the south wall, the candle flame leaned toward her. She knelt and held the flame low, and she felt the cold breath of air coming up between two boards. She set the candle in its saucer on the floor beside her and worked her fingers along the seam. The boards there were shorter than the others and cut clean at both ends, and the nails had been driven into them not from above, but at an angle from the sides, so that the heads were flush against the neighboring planks, and did not show unless a person was looking. And Mara was looking, because Hedka had taught her to look. She got up and took the short-handled axe from the corner and turned it butt side down and used the flat pole to lever gently at one end of the shorter boards. The nails came up with a small dry protest that she felt more than heard. The first board lifted, then the second, then the third. She was looking down into a square hole cut in the pine plank floor and edged with a frame of hewn oak, and below the hole was a set of 5 earthen steps, and at the bottom a plank door and a plank frame set into the mountain itself. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the hole for a while, with her hand at her throat, where the tin locket lay cold against her green skin. Then she took up the candle in one hand and steadied herself against the frame with the other, and went down the 5 earthen steps and stood in front of the door. The door was of the same pine as the floor, gone dark and hard with time, hung on 2 wrought iron strap hinges, closed with a wooden peg through a hasp. There was no lock. Someone had cut into the top plank with a knife in careful upright letters the words, "To whoever finds this, go gently." Mara read the words twice by candlelight. Then she drew the peg out of the hasp and set it on the step behind her, and lifted the door open on its hinges. And the hinges gave a slow, low creak that had been waiting in them for 90 years. The cellar behind the door was small, perhaps 6 feet square, cut into the rock and lined with plank on 3 walls. The air inside was dry and cold and smelled of old wood and old cloth and faintly of tallow. Mara held the candle up. Along the far wall stood a low pine shelf with 3 items ranged on it, as if set out that morning: a small wooden box of the kind used for tea, bound in tin at the corners, a folded oilskin packet the size of a family Bible, and a stoneware jar with a wooden lid sealed around the rim with wax. On the floor below the shelf sat a leather saddlebag, cracked at the fold and dark with age, and beside it a smaller canvas sack tied at the neck with hemp cord. Above the shelf, a single piece of paper was pinned to the plank with a square nail. The paper was yellowed and stiff and written on in the same upright hand as the words on the door. Mara took the paper down carefully with her fingernails and carried it and the candle up the 5 steps and set them on the floor of the shack beside the stove. She sat cross-legged on the pine boards in the warming room and unfolded the paper on her lap. The paper was headed with a date, the 9th of October, in a year, 90 years gone. And it read, "My name is Ayuka Bram Meal. I was born in the eastern settlements in the spring of the year before the last Great War. I came into this country in a wagon with my husband Amos Neal and our 2 boys in the summer of my 24th year. Amos built this shack with his own hands to hold a line camp on a claim we filed in the valley below. We wintered here 3 years and summered down in the meadow. Amos died of a fall from a horse in the fourth spring. The two boys took a fever the winter after and were buried under the fir at the head of the meadow. I lived on here alone another 6 years and worked the claim and traded pelts at the settlement 2 days south. The claim is proved and filed under my name at the land office at Fort Colvin. The papers of that filing are in the oilskin on the shelf. Below this note, I am going down out of the mountain tomorrow to my sister's people in the low country, because my hands will not hold an axe anymore. I do not wish to die alone in the shack where my husband and my boys were happy. What is in this room I am leaving for whoever comes. In the tea box is coin I saved out of the pelt trade over 10 years, $92 in gold and silver. In the stoneware jar is lard rendered clean this fall, and it will keep. In the saddle bag are Amos's tools, which are good. In the canvas sack is seed. I do not know who will come here or when. I hope it is someone who needs it. Be gentle with the place. It was loved. Signed, Ayuka Bram Neal, this 9th day of October. Mara sat on the pine floor with the letter across her knee and did not move for a long time. The stove made its small, even sound. The wind outside came around the eaves and went on. Ayuka Bram Neal, she said aloud. Once, in the empty shack, the name went into the warming air and stayed there, and Mara put her hand at her throat and closed her fingers around the tin locket on its braided horsehair cord, and felt the scratched initial H against the pad of her thumb, and she understood. Without any evidence beyond the name on the page and the shape of that surname in her own life, that Hetka Bram, who had taken her in 3 winters and taught her every skill by which she had come off the ridge alive, had come out of the same people as the woman who had left this room 90 years ago, for whoever came next. Bram. The name sat in both their lives like a river that ran underground and surfaced in 2 different valleys. Hetka had never spoken of a cousin in the mountains. Hetka had probably not known, but Hetka had been made by the same Orc women who made Ayuka, the same Eastern settlement people, the same hands, the same knowledge, the same way of cutting a hide and laying a fire and walking in snow without breaking through the crust. It was in Hetka's hands, when they closed around Mara's hands, to teach her the whetstone. And it was in Mara's hands now, green and calloused and cold, holding a letter written by a woman who had wanted someone she would never meet to have a place to stand. 2 Orc women, 2 generations apart, neither of whom had ever met the girl they saved. One had given her the skills, the other had given her the place to use them, and between the 2 of them, they had carried Mara off a mountain that was supposed to kill her. She slept that first night on the plank bunk with a gray wool blanket over the borrowed coat and the stove dampened down to a red seam, and in the morning she opened the door on a hard white world and began to work. The first work was the roof. Mara climbed onto the bunk, then onto the shelf, and pushed a broom handle up against the rotted ridge until she found the soft places and knew where the water would come in when the thaw began. Then she came down and took inventory. In Amos Neal's saddlebag were a full-size felling axe with a hickory helve dark with old sweat, a hand adze, a 2-pound hammer, a wood chisel, a small bit, and brace, a whetstone, a coil of tarred hemp twine, a leather awl, a horseshoe rasp, a can of tallow with a wooden lid, and a folded oiled rag holding 6 good iron files. In the canvas sack were seeds and twists of paper marked in Ayuka's upright hand: turnip, cabbage, kale, onion, pole bean, and a heavier twist marked simply corn. The lard in the stoneware jar was pale and clean under a thumb of gray at the top. Beneath the gray, it smelled the way lard is supposed to smell. The tea box held $92 in mixed coin. Mara counted it twice and put it back and slid the box under the plank bunk against the log wall. For 6 days, she did not leave the ridge. She melted snow in the iron skillet for water, cut the stale bread into rations, chewed the hard sausage a piece at a time, and ate 2 spoons of the good lard morning and night for the heat it gave her. She sharpened the axe on the whetstone with slow circular strokes, the way Hetka Bram had shown her at 9 years old, until the edge would part a hair off her green forearm. She went out in the middle hours when the sun stood highest and cut standing dead pine from the fold above the shack, dragged it back 1 length at a time on a loop of twine, and split it small enough for the box stove, her orc arms driving the axe through the frozen wood with a power that would have taken a human twice the blows. She pulled fallen chinking clay from the north wall seams with her fingers, warmed water on the stove, mixed the clay with pine needles and a little of the lard for binding, and packed the seams from inside, working from the top course down. She cut fresh cedar shakes from a windfall with the hand adze, split them along the grain, and by the 8th day she had laid a patch 4 feet across over the worst of the ridge sag and nailed it home with square nails from the tobacco tin under the bunk. Each night she wrote in the margins of Ayuka's letter, because she had no paper of her own, small notes what she had done that day, what needed doing tomorrow, the temperature as she judged it by the frost patterns on the inside of the boarded window, and at the bottom of each day's notes, 2 words: be steady. On the 10th day, the wind swung to the south and the crust softened in the sun, and Mara knew the trail would open before the passes did. She packed the oilskin packet of filing papers, $40 of Ayuka's coin, her own $4.80, the written character from Mrs. Ames still in its envelope, a wedge of the good lard in a twist of oilcloth, and the tin locket which had never left her throat. She barred the shack door from outside with a plank wedged under the latch and walked south along the ridge on the road Ayuka had walked 90 years before her, toward the settlement, 2 days away. She slept one night in a stand of fir with a small fire built behind a rock, the way Hetka had taught her, the rock throwing heat back toward her body while the fire consumed the wood. She did not sleep deeply. The cold kept pulling at the edges of her rest, but she slept enough. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, she came down out of the pines into a wagon track and followed it into the settlement at Fort Colvin. It was the first time in 10 days she had seen another person, and the experience of walking into a human town alone, green-skinned and trail-worn and carrying nothing but a canvas sack and a leather pouch, produced the particular feeling she had known her entire life, the feeling of being looked at and seen incompletely, the feeling of being sorted into a category before she had opened her mouth. The land office at Fort Colvin was a single room with a plank counter and a coal stove, kept by a clerk named Ambrose Lund, 58, thin and slow-moving, who had sat behind that counter for 21 years and had seen enough of the territory's business to have lost the capacity for surprise. He looked up when Mara came in, and his eyes registered her green skin and her trail-worn clothes and the oilskin packet she set on the counter, and he processed all of it with the efficiency of a man who cataloged facts for a living. Mara opened the packet. Ambrose Lund read the filing papers through his wire spectacles, then read them again, then went to a shelf of ledgers along the back wall and took down a leather-bound volume marked in the year Ayuka had written her letter. He turned pages for a quarter of an hour without speaking. When he looked up, he told Mara that the claim had been filed and proved and never abandoned on the books, that no tax had been laid on unpatented ground in that valley in her lifetime, and that, if she could show relation to the filler or an instrument of conveyance, the ground would carry to her. Mara said her name aloud and said Hetka Bram's name, and said Ayuka Bram Neal's name, and Ambrose Lund wrote all 3 on a sheet of foolscap and told her the process would want a witness from the family line and a magistrate's seal, which could be gotten in 6 weeks if she was patient. Mara said she was patient. Ambrose Lund almost smiled, and did not, and gave her a receipt for the papers he kept in his drawer. If you have ever watched someone walk into a room with nothing and walk out with the beginning of everything, then you know what this moment felt like. Hit subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human right now, so you do not miss what happens next. Tap the like button. What comes next is worth the wait. She took a room that night above the feed store for 15 cents. The woman who kept it was Ruth Halloran, 44, widowed 6 years, a human woman who fed Mara a bowl of bean soup with a slice of onion on top and did not ask where she had come from, or why her skin was green, or how she had ended up in Fort Colvin in the middle of December, with trail dust in her hair and exhaustion in her face. Ruth Halloran simply handed her the bowl and said, "Eat while it is hot." And Mara ate, and the soup was the best thing she had tasted in 10 days, and she said so. And Ruth Halloran nodded and said, "There is more. if you want it. It was such a small thing, a bowl of soup offered without conditions. But Mara would remember it for the rest of her life, because it was the first time in weeks that a stranger had given her something without expecting anything back, except that she eat it while it was hot. In the morning, Mara went to the mercantile and spent $7 on flour, cornmeal, salt, coffee, dried apples, a paper of tea, a bar of yellow soap, a bolt of unbleached muslin for a shift, 2 spools of thread, a package of needles, a hatchet head to replace the chipped one on the short axe at the shack, a small crock, and 8 hens' eggs packed in bran in a tin pail with a wire handle. The mercantile keeper was Ren Ivers, 61, who had known Hetka Bram at market Saturdays years ago, and when Mara said whose people she was tracing, the shape of the name Bram produced something in Ren Ivers' face that Mara recognized. Not surprise, recognition. The recognition of a thread that ran through the territory's history, connecting people who had never met across decades of distance. Ren Ivers gave her the eggs at cost, and a length of tarred cord besides. Mara loaded her purchases into a canvas grain sack, shouldered it, and started back up the wagon track before noon. She was 2 hours out of Fort Colvin when a freighter pulled up alongside her and asked if she wanted a lift as far as the fork. The freighter was Otis Meriden, 37, a human man who ran a 2-mule wagon between the settlements twice a month and who had heard in town that morning about the Orc Girl with the 90-year papers. He took her as far as the fork and would not accept a coin for it, and he told her that if she meant to keep the shack, he would carry a load of milled boards up in the spring for the price of the trip, which he named as $1.50. Mara shook his hand across the wagon seat. It was a human hand, shaking a green hand, and neither of them commented on it, because neither of them needed to. Otis Meriden nodded once and drove on. Back at the shack, Mara set the eggs into a straw nest in the wooden box under the bunk, hung the muslin from the pegs above the bed, and began the second round of work. She cut a north window into the log wall at shoulder height, with the bit and brace and the wood chisel, framed it in with hewn pine, and glazed it with oiled paper stretched on a light frame that would take a proper pane later. She built a small lean-to on the east end for a woodshed, using unmilled poles and the leftover cedar shakes. She laid a stone path between the shack door and the spring seep, 30 yards down the fold where water came clear from under a rock all winter. When Otis Meriden came up in April with the promised boards, he brought with him a man named Booker Alden, 29, a joiner by trade with a bad left hand from a saw accident, a human man who stayed 2 days and helped Mara hang a proper plank door with iron hinges he had forged himself. He would take payment only in a jar of the good lard, and 24 of the eggs a hen he had brought up from Fort Colvin had begun to lay for her. Booker Alden was the kind of man who judged people by their work rather than their appearance. He watched Mara swing an axe and frame a window and chisel a mortise joint, and whatever he thought about working alongside an orc woman on a mountainside, what he said was, "Your joints are clean." Who taught you? A woman named Hetka Bram. She taught you well. That was all he said about it. They worked side by side for 2 days, and the door he helped her hang was plumb and true and would still be swinging properly 30 years later. The claim came through in the last week of May. A magistrate rode up from Fort Colvin with Ambrose Lund and a witness named Aletta Bram Fenner, 72, who had come down out of the low country by rail and wagon, on Ambrose's letter, and who was the daughter of Ayuka Bram Neal's youngest sister and the second cousin twice removed of Hetka Bram. Aletta Bram Fenner was a small orc woman with silver-green skin and hands that shook slightly and eyes that were perfectly clear. She sat on the plank bunk in the shack and looked around the room and touched the pine wall with the flat of her hand. She told Mara that she remembered being taken as a small girl to see Ayuka off the train the day she came down out of the mountain, and that Ayuka had lived 4 more years in her sister's house and died in a bed by a south window and was buried under a chestnut tree with a plain stone. She talked about this place, Aletta said. She said she left something here for whoever came next. She never said what it was. She just said she hoped they would need it. The magistrate wrote out the patent. Ambrose Lund countersigned it. Aletta Bram Fenner made her mark, and Mara, 22 of Elk Ridge, was named on paper as the holder of the claim in the valley below the shack. 160 acres of timber, meadow, and creek. Patented and free. An orc girl from the flats, raised in pieces, left for dead on a mountain. Now standing in a shack her people had built 90 years ago, holding a piece of paper that said the ground beneath her feet was hers, not borrowed, not conditional, not dependent on someone else's willingness to let her stay, hers. In the meadow below the shack, Mara broke ground with a borrowed single-blade plow and Otis Merridin's near mule. She planted Ayuka's corn in 6 long rows along the south fence line, the turnip and cabbage and kale in a squared kitchen plot behind the lean-to, and the pole beans up hazel poles cut from the fold. What came up was hers. She dried the beans on the vine, pulled the turnips in the cold moon of October, salted the cabbage in the crock she had bought at Fort Colvin, and hung braided onions from the ridgepole of the woodshed. Wren Ivers took the extra dried beans at store credit and sold them under a paper card that read, Elk Ridge. And by the second winter, a small trade in Mara's beans and her yellow soap, which she had begun to make from the good lard and wood ash from the stove, had begun to move down the wagon road as far as the rail town in the low country. Small rituals settled around her the way snow settles around a good roof. On the first Saturday of each month, Ruth Halloran walked out to meet Mara at the edge of Fort Colvin with a pot of coffee wrapped in a folded quilt. They drank it, standing by the freight scales before Mara went into the mercantile. A human woman and an orc woman standing in the morning cold, sharing coffee without ceremony. And the people of Fort Colvin who saw them doing it gradually stopped finding it remarkable. On the last day of every month, Mara sat at the plank table by her north window with a leather-bound ledger Booker Alden had given her, and wrote out in the same upright hand she had begun to school her letters into what she had taken in and what she had spent. And at the bottom of each page she wrote the words, "Be steady," small in the corner, the way Hetka had written them in the locket, the way Ayuka had written her letter. Small, steady words from steady women, passed forward like seeds in twists of paper. By the end of that first summer, people at Fort Colvin knew Mara by name and by the shape of her work. She came down off the ridge every third Saturday with a pack on her back and traded at Wren Ivers' mercantile, and she paid in coin and in the small, clean bars of yellow soap she made from lard and ash. The soap was good. It lathered well and smelled of pine, and it did not crack when it dried. Ruth Halloran was the first to buy it, and she told the postmaster's wife, who told the farrier's wife, who told a woman at the rail town, and before long Mara's soap had a reputation that traveled faster and farther than Mara herself ever did. The co-founded crochet designed a separate into the rest, and a few of the co-founded marriages designed a separate rest between marriages, designed a separate rest. Now they are ready to fall after marriages. The death is after rest. The lie between marriages. She was called Miss Mara now by the clerk at the land office, and by the postmaster and by the farrier down at the fork. She was called Mara by Ruth Halloran and Wren Ivers and Otis Merridin and Booker Alden. And she was called something else entirely by June, the milk goat, whom she had bought from a family down at the crossing for $4. A brown nanny with a calm disposition and a willingness to follow Mara up the ridge on a lead rope without balking once. June was called June because Mara had bought her in June, and the name suited the goat the way simple names suit simple creatures, who know exactly what they are and do not require anything more elaborate. Otis Merridin brought loads up to the fork in April and June and September. Booker Alden came in July and helped Mara raise a small pole barn against the west side of the shack for the goat. They worked side by side for 2 days, the human joiner and the orc woman, and the barn they built was tight and sound, and it kept June warm through the following winter without a single draft. The shack was changing slowly with each trip down and each load carried up. It was becoming something other than a shelter. Mara whitewashed the inside wall behind the stove with lime she had carried up from Fort Colvin in a canvas bag. She sewed a curtain for the new north window from the muslin bolt and hemmed it with the small, neat stitches Hetka had taught her. She hung a rag rug Ruth Halloran had made from Mara's worn-out calico and sent up by the freight. She set Ayuka's letter under a square of oilcloth on the shelf above the bunk, beside the folded envelope with Mrs. Ames's written character still inside it. She had never opened the character after the first day. She kept it only because she did not throw paper away. The line shack had become a house, the claim had become a homestead, and the girl who had been set down in the snow above the ridge to disappear had become, in the plain accounting of the people at Fort Colvin, a woman with a place. At the first hard frost of the second autumn, Oletta Bram Fenner sent up by Otis Meriden a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a length of good black wool, fine enough for a proper winter dress, and a short letter in Oletta's shaky hand that said only, "My aunt would be pleased." Mara sewed the dress by the north window across 4 evenings, working by lamplight, cutting the wool with the care it deserved. She had not owned a dress this fine since the calico Mrs. Ames had given her when she started work, and even that had been a cast-off. This was new cloth, bought and sent for her specifically by a woman she had met once, because of a connection that ran 90 years deep through a family that had never stopped looking out for its own, even when the ones being looked out for did not know they belonged. She wore the black wool dress to Fort Colvin on the first Saturday of December, and Wren Ivers, seeing her come in through the mercantile door in her black dress and her braided horsehair cord, with the tin locket at her throat, said, "Miss Mara," and did not add anything to it. The name hung in the air of the mercantile the way good names do, with weight and with respect and with the particular recognition that comes when a community has watched someone build something from nothing and has finally found the words for what it thinks of them. Miss Mara. 2 words that contained everything the people of Fort Colvin had decided about the Orc woman on the ridge, which was that she was capable and honest and steady, and that the color of her skin had turned out to be the least interesting thing about her, which was something most of them would not have predicted a year earlier, and all of them were quietly pleased to have learned. The second winter was hard, but Mara was ready for it. The woodshed was full. The root cellar held jars of lard and crocks of salted cabbage and braided onions hanging from the shelf braces. June the goat was housed in the pole barn with hay Booker Alden had helped save in August. The stove drew well, and the chinking held, and the roof patch Mara had laid in her first desperate week was still sound. The cedar shakes she had split with her own hands, holding the snow and the rain and the wind, the way good shakes do, by being exactly what they are and nothing more. She broke ground in the meadow for the second year's planting. The corn had done well, better than she expected at this altitude, and the beans had produced enough to trade. She added a row of potato starts she had gotten from Wren Ivers in exchange for a winter supply of soap, and she fenced the kitchen garden properly with split rails she cut and hauled from the timber above the fold. People came up sometimes, not often because the ride was long and the trail was steep, but they came. Booker Alden came in spring and fall to help with whatever project Mara had planned, and he never came empty-handed. Always a tool or a piece of hardware or a sack of nails, and he always left with lard and eggs and sometimes a jar of the pickled turnips Mara had learned to make from a recipe Ruth Halloran had given her. Otis Meriden came with his loads and stayed for coffee and told Mara the news from the rail town, which was usually not much, but which she listened to with the attention of a woman who understood that knowing what was happening in the world beyond the ridge was part of staying alive in it. Ruth Halloran came up once, in September of the second year, riding a borrowed horse with the careful posture of a woman who had not been on a horse in 6 years, and was not entirely certain she wanted to be on one now. She brought a brass kerosene lamp with the wick already trimmed, and a book of verse she had bought at a peddler's wagon, and she stayed 2 nights. She slept on the bunk, while Mara slept on the pallet of folded blankets by the stove. And in the evenings, they sat at the plank table and drank coffee, and talked about things women talk about when they are alone together and do not need to perform for anyone. About the price of flour and the quality of this year's hay, and the way the light fell on the meadow at certain times of day. About the men they had known and the ones they had not. About the feeling of being alone, and the difference between the loneliness that comes from having no one and the solitude that comes from choosing your own company. When Ruth left, she stood in the yard and looked at the shack and the barn and the garden and the stone path and the woodshed and the meadow stretching down to the creek, and she said, "You have done well, Mara." Mara looked at the homestead she had built with her green hands and the tools of a woman who had been dead 90 years and the skills of a woman who had been dead 7. "I had help," she said. "You had instruction," Ruth corrected. "The doing was yours." On a clear, cold evening in the 3rd winter after she had been set down on the ridge, Mara sat at the plank table under the north window, in the black wool dress with a mug of coffee cooling at her elbow and the leather-bound ledger open in front of her. She did not write in it for a long time. The stove was drawing well. June was shut into the pole barn for the night with a manger of hay. The lamp on the table was the brass kerosene lamp Ruth Halloran had sent up in September with the wick already trimmed. Outside the new pane of glass, the snow was coming down straight and quiet in the windless dark, and the light from the lamp fell on the pine boards of the floor in a soft yellow square that reached almost to the seam where 3 years earlier she had lifted the shortcut boards with the pole of a chipped axe. She looked at that seam for a while. She had never nailed it shut again. She had cleaned the edges, sanded them with a scrap of stone, waxed them with tallow, and fitted the boards back so they lay flush and could be lifted with a fingernail. Below them, the 5 earthen steps went down to the old plank door with its 90-year hinges, and behind the door, the small cellar held now what she kept there: a shelf of jars of good lard, braided onions, salted cabbage in the Fort Colvin crock, the tea box that still held the last $22 of Ayuka Bram Neal's coin, which Mara had not spent because she did not need to, and because the money felt less like currency and more like a trust, something that had been passed to her and might need to be passed again. And on the top plank of the shelf, where Ayuka had left her letter, a folded square of oilskin that held nothing more than a scrap of paper on which Mara had written in her own upright hand, "Be steady, in case whoever came next should need to read it." Above her, on the shelf, over the bunk, lay the 2 papers that had made the difference. The letter from Ayuka Bram Neal, who had come into the country at 24 with a husband and 2 boys, and gone out alone at 40, and who had written her sentences plainly enough that a girl 90 years later could sit by a stove and understand them. And under Ayuka's letter, the patent from the land office at Fort Colvin, with Ambrose Lund's careful signature, and Oleta Bram Fenner's shaky mark and the magistrate's red seal. Mara took both papers down from time to time and read them. And each time she read them, she thought of Hetka Bram, who had shown her how to lay a fire to hold coals through the night, and how to walk in snow without breaking through the crust, and how not to weep in another woman's pantry, and how a person who does not know where they are is already half lost. Hetka had never spoken of a cousin in the mountains. Hetka had probably not known. But Hetka had been made by the same Eastern settlement women who made Ayuka, and that was in her hands when they closed around Mara's hands to teach her the whetstone. And it was in Mara's hands now when she closed the stove damper for the night. The same Orc hands passed down through generations like the seeds in Ayuka's twists of paper, carrying knowledge that would grow wherever it was planted if the ground was willing. She touched the tin locket at her throat, the plain one on the braided horsehair cord with the scratched initial H on the back and the folded square of paper inside. And she thought, as she often thought on quiet evenings when the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and the snow was falling on the shakes she had cut, and laid herself of the 2 women who had loved her without ever being asked to. Hetka Bram, who had raised her in 3 winters and left her a locket and 2 words, and Ayuka Bram Neal, who had never known her name and had left her a house and a claim and a letter that began, "To whoever finds this, go gently." 2 Orc women from 2 lives, both of whom had wanted a girl they never got to see grow up to have a place to stand. And between the 2 of them, across 90 years and 100 miles of mountain, they had given her one. Somewhere down in the low country, Rutherford Ames was running his ranch along the North Fork, and Mrs. Ames was standing in her kitchen with her hands flat against her apron. And Ford Kessler was drawing wages somewhere, and Ridley Pace, if he was still alive, was 22 now, the age Mara had been when they left her on the shelf above the drop. Mara did not think of them often. And when she did, she thought of them without heat, the way a person thinks of weather that has already passed over the ridge. They had believed they were setting a girl down to disappear. What they had done instead, without meaning to, was point her at the one door in the country that had been waiting 90 years for her hand on its latch. An Orc girl's hand. A green hand, calloused and strong, trained by two women who had never met each other, reaching for a wooden peg on a plank door at the bottom of 5 earthen steps, in a cellar beneath a pine floor, in a line shack on a ridge, in a valley that would become her home. She closed the ledger. She wrote nothing in it that night. She banked the stove the way Hetka had taught her so the kitchen would still be warm at noon. She blew out the lamp and lay down on the plank bunk, under the gray wool blanket with the good black wool dress hung on its peg, and the tin locket warm against her green throat. And she listened to the snow on the cedar shakes she had cut and laid herself, and the sound was the sound of a roof holding, the sound of a house that had been loved and left and found and loved again, the sound of a life that had been meant to end on a mountain and had instead become something quiet and steady and permanent, built from the inside out by hands that had been taught to be useful and had never once forgotten how. Mara was 22 when she was left for dead on the winter trail above Elk Ridge. She had $4.80 pinned inside her petticoat, a borrowed wool coat on her back, and a tin locket at her throat. And she walked half a mile off the ridge to a shack no one wanted and lifted 3 short boards off a pine floor. It was the best half-mile she ever walked. If this story sat with you the way stories like this are meant to sit, quietly and for a while after, take a moment to subscribe to Orc Girl Meets Human and share it with someone who's been counted out and is still walking. And before you go, sit with this, who in your own life, living or long gone, taught you the small, steady skills that would one day carry you through a winter they never saw. Leave their name in the comments. Say it once, the way Mara said Ayuka's. Let us know where you are watching from, and we will see you by the next fire.